Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here, and this is Gunnerkrigg Court, Chapter 66, Memories of the Worthless.
Hello.
So, a few important things happen in this chapter, so let's just get straight into it. And in this first page, I kind of wanted to convey the idea that Coyote's fingers were coming in here and placing images of Annie into Isengrin's mind over his feelings of hatred. And we can see in the next page that Coyote is sort of meddling around with the inside of Isengrin's head, even though he's also sitting there and talking to Annie and Smitty and, I guess, a little badger here.
What do you think they're talking about with the badger?
Well, it's not important. Just dealing with forest business. I'm sure the badger had a concern of his that he brought to them. But Isengrin's kind of out of sorts, not really paying attention, and we see that Coyote is looking over some past interactions with Isengrin.
We've always seen that Coyote and Isengrin's relationship is not exactly a healthy one, but I think this chapter, especially with Isengrin's actions later, really casts a darker shadow on it than we've seen before. How much did you feel like this would be a surprise to readers, or how much did you want to reveal in this chapter?
Well, Coyote's always been a pretty shady character, but ever since chapter 39, that's when people were explicitly shown that Coyote was up to something, with Isengrin directly and messing around with his mind. And in this chapter, all of that basically comes to a head, and a bunch of other stuff that was laid down in the story previously. And so when things are brought up in this sequence of events here, I didn't want them to seem like they came out of nowhere, but I did want it to seem like a surprise that all this was coming back now. And so I was hoping that the readers were not seeing this coming, but when all the stuff goes down, I was hoping that it would sort of make sense, with all the stuff that we've seen in their interactions in the past. And we're just seeing a little compilation of memories that Coyote's probably extracted from Isengrin. Before getting to a more recent revelation that Coyote knows that Jean has been taken away from the Annan waters, and here actually we see him crossing over to the court side, which is a fairly big deal in the relationship between the court and Coyote, but it's just done very subtly here and very slyly. And that was just a little setup to lead into the scene here where we see that Coyote's decided to give Isengrin what he's always wanted, really, his strength. And this kind of relates to one of the side comics called Coyote, which is a little comic I did about Coyote traveling the world and gathering his powers and changing his aspect. And one of the elements in that is that he represents the strength that he has as this big red stripe on his back. And I was kind of interested in the imagery of him sort of ripping it off the back like a big band-aid and then passing it on to Isengrin here.
One thing I like about this page that I wanted to ask you about was the way that you've made Isengrin look so small compared to Coyote.
Yeah, and I love playing with Coyote's scale and changing the size of him, and he really does that whenever he needs to assert basically his dominance over whoever it is he's talking to. And he's perfectly happy to be very tiny as well sometimes, but I always imagine him basically changing scale just constantly. And here he's being pretty intimidating. It's not like a very pretty scene. I wanted it to seem kind of gross and weird. And I kind of imagine that Coyote's, say, default size is just bigger than everybody else in the room. And when I draw the sort of half-skull Coyote here, that's kind of what I imagine what Coyote looks like underneath everything. That's really his essence,
Well, in relation to the scale thing, it kind of makes me think of when Coyote first appeared back in Thanks to Summertime, where Annie says a god came out of Gilly Wood, and we see Isengrin with a tiny coyote next to him, and we kind of all assumed that Coyote was like Isengrin's little dog or something, and it was cool when it was revealed that Coyote was the one who was the god.
Yeah, and that goes to showing that while Coyote is a big show-off and a big ham, his personality is that he doesn't need to constantly show how strong and intimidating he is for him to get that across. Everybody knows, including Coyote, that he is extremely dangerous, and so he's perfectly happy to represent himself as a small-looking dog, for example, or a very tiny creature, because that's something that could change in the click of a finger,
I remember being very worried about Isengrin when this page came up.
Yeah, and Annie is too. Isengrin has been given this gift, and it doesn't really seem to be sitting well for him. I think everybody on this page, all the readers, were kind of in Andrew's side, kind of looking a little bit worried, while Annie is trying to see the best in the situation. She knows Isengrin, but she also knows that something's not quite right. And straight away, things go pretty badly for Coyote.
I thought this moment was very surprising and sad and well done, because Isengrin has always talked about how much he loves Coyote, how much he's happy with his decisions, yet the second that he got any kind of power over Coyote, the first thing he did was just rip into him. And it surprised me because I had taken Isengrin for granted when he said he just loves Coyote and there's nothing more to it. But this really showed the anger that it made me realize was always there, and I just thought it was well done.
Well, we'll see later on that he does still very much love Coyote, and he's developed this weird sense of logic that him destroying Coyote's body is part of showing how much he reveres and respects Coyote, you know. But that's something to touch on a little bit later on.
It kind of reminded me of Annie, too, in a way, and showed me how similar they are, because Annie is another person who goes to great lengths to hide the anger that she feels, but when it flashes out, it's very huge.
Yeah, Annie and Sengren have always been kind of similar, like, personality-wise. Obviously, like, they're very different people, but I think their closeness with each other comes from a mutual understanding of their personalities. And here we see, I guess, that Sengren has failed in the goal of keeping his strength in check. And he's actually imparted that specific advice to Annie previously, that she has the power to hurt other people, and if she doesn't keep that under control, then she could cause somebody harm. But here, when Sengren is given all this extra power, he wasn't able to do that himself.
Well, I just want to say also that even though it was a surprise to me that Sengren would do this, it also made total sense. But were you worried at all about it being kind of gruesome for this comic?
Well, I did keep it in mind how graphic I wanted it to be, but specifically with Coyote kind of being torn apart here, I imagined it more like Sengren is tearing apart a clay figure. You know, I didn't want to show like blood and guts and entrails and stuff flying around. I've always wanted Coyote to seem like a creature that has moved beyond the physical aspect of living creatures, and so he's a creature that has done away with the need for example entrails and guts and anything like that. So what we see that is inside him is all these memories that he's been hoarding from Sengren.
Almost the scariest part of this attack is Coyote's look of fear and surprise and pain, even, because we normally don't see those expressions on his face ever.
That's right.
Is that an okay thing to say? I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
So here's something that just occurred to me. We see Jean in Sengren's memories that he's regaining there. Does that mean this is the first time he's learning, or at least remembering, that Jean is gone?
Oh yeah, he's learning all the information that Coyote has himself. And so he's gaining the knowledge that Jean is gone now, and he's basically gaining everything that Coyote was and everything that Coyote knew.
With as close as Annie and Sengren are, would she have tried to trust him with this stuff about Jean, and Coyote removed it, or would she know that it would be a bad idea to tell him about that?
Well, it's not something that she would have discussed with him, because she would have kept the plan with Jean and the Annan Waters hidden from the court and the forest. It's something that the gang have gotten together and done of their own accord. And she didn't even know that Coyote was aware of what happened. But either way, now that Sengren has learned of all this, it's time to hightail it out of there. And as Annie and Smitty are fleeing, Sengren and Coyote become a new creature entirely. And with this design, I was just going for a very literal mixture of Sengren and Coyote.
These next couple of pages, I know that you don't want it to just be like me complimenting you and saying how great you are and stuff in these videos, but I do just want to say I think these are some of the best pages that you've done, this little chase scene here. So it's just really fluid and exciting, and I think it captures the motion really well, which is hard to do in comics. And I remember when I first read these pages, I was just like really excited about it, and it's just like really tense and well done. So I love these pages.
Well, thanks. It was pretty fun to draw all this stuff. It's just a bridge getting knocked over at this point, but the imagery of the bridge has been there right since the beginning of the comic, and for me it was a pretty big moment to have it destroyed and show the ravine in this state. And getting back to some elements that Sengren and I planted back in chapter 14. And this stuff was fun to draw too, kind of large-scale destruction amidst all the buildings of the court, which is something that really has not happened in the story at all up to this point. Did
it almost feel sad to kind of finally bring together those elements that you must have planned so long ago?
Oh no, I was really looking forward to it. This whole latter half of the chapter is like a bunch of chain reactions that I was really looking forward to getting to finally. Not only the trees exploding through the court, but also the robots all getting together and heading off, and the stuff with the forest coming to a head.
It's cool how with the robots, we're so used to seeing them with the green eyes that just seeing them with the red eyes now indicates something is going on.
Yeah, there's been a few instances before where I've shown Robot and some of the other robots with orange or red eyes, depending on the warning level. But here now, the robots are constantly in a warning state, I suppose, and they're off in one big group. And so while Annie and Smitty are scrabbling off to warn the appropriate people, I was able to draw the destruction of another part of the court, and it's the first part of the court that we see at the very beginning of the comic, the steps right at the front where the bridge was. So that was kind of cool too.
I remember you told me that you were glad that you wouldn't have to draw them anymore.
Yeah, it's a lot of steps. But now no more.
And you mentioned to me also when these pages were going up that you wanted this sort of fusion character to kind of be in a flux between shapes and stuff, like the form that he has is just as malleable as Coyote's was.
Well, I'd say that he is not quite as malleable as Coyote, and that is definitely the influence that Isengrin has on this combination of the two. And that's another thing that we'll kind of get into a little bit later on when we find out more about what or who this creature is. And we continue with a look back, I guess, on certain elements of the comic where Annie goes back to Renard and she gets the beacon that Eglamour gave her and recalls back to chapter 23 when Parley accidentally teleports everybody back to her room. But there's no time for joking around, and Eglamour and Parley are very quickly brought back up to speed and they seem to know what to do in this situation.
I thought that Renard's comment that it finally happened was interesting because it sort of implies that he's been waiting for this, which is interesting because he never seemed to respect Isengrin very much, but he at least respected his power enough to think that he might be able to go against Coyote someday.
Yeah, Renard knew that something was going to happen. Maybe not specifically this, but yeah, he knew that something was coming down the line. And it looks like the court does have something up their sleeve for this kind of situation, and we see that the robots have banded together to erect some sort of shield. And it puts a stop to the attack from this creature, who then decides to slink back into the forest, and then send up a symbol requesting a formal meeting. And that is where the chapter ends pretty abruptly after the attack. And I didn't feel that it was appropriate to have a regular bonus page here. I just did a spot illustration of a mixture of all three of these creatures, Isengrin, Coyote, and the new guy.
It's kind of sad to think that Isengrin and Coyote, as we know them, are gone, but it's pretty interesting to see what'll happen next.
Yeah, well, there's still more to come, and things are certainly going to be different from now on. And I did see this as a big turning point for the court as an environment, definitely, and the forest too. And as the story continues, we'll see how all the characters come to grips with the situation. But until then, that's the end of that chapter. So come back again for chapter 67, Evac.
See ya!